Welcome to another Get Legit webinar. Ask an attorney with Huck. Ingram. Today is Wednesday, April 23rd, 2025. My name is Erin. I am the Education and Communications Manager here at the Nevada County Cannabis Alliance. I would like to thank everyone for joining us this afternoon. It is our hope that anyone interested in commercial cannabis here in Nevada County will take the time to tune into these webinars, educate themselves, and continue to be or become stewards of the environment and of our community. The Get Legit educational series provides the preparation necessary to assist in securing a local cultivation permit and state cultivation license. The series includes webinars, support groups, business skills training, and a mentor program. All Get Legit webinars are online, free of charge, and open to the public. Now, what is the Alliance? The Alliance is a nonprofit trade association representing the local cannabis community here in Nevada County. Our mission is to support public policy initiatives through representative advocacy, provide educational opportunities, and create space for connection within the industry and the greater community. We provide services to our members like a consistent voice and representation locally and at the statewide level. We have monthly educational webinars to assist with the permitting and licensing process, much like the one you are on today. We have a buddy program to pair permitted farmers with new farmers, a Slack online hub for resource sharing and local policy updates, and seasonal supply chain industry mixers. How to stay in touch? You can become a member if you are not one already. You can become a sponsor. I will link all these in the chat as well for how you can become a member and a sponsor as well. You can follow us on Facebook and Instagram. Our Facebook is just Nevada County Cannabis Alliance, and Instagram is at Nevada County Alliance. We have a bi-monthly newsletter that you can subscribe to on our website. I'll link that to the chat as well. And any additional questions, I'll put the email that you can email in the chat as well. I'd like to give a shout out to our allied industry business sponsors. We've got Ag Natural, Finest, Humboldt Seed Company, California Ag Labs, Mr. B's Green Trees, Gold Coast Botanicals, and Bulk Market. Thank you all for your support. We could not do this without you. And today's format of the webinar is just going to be a Q&A with Huck Ingram. I hope you brought your questions. Your participation is encouraged. There is a chat section and a Q&A, and we will be using them the whole time. Please use them. The more questions that you have, the more useful that this webinar will be for everyone. This webinar is being recorded and will be available on our website at nccannabisalliance.org under our Get Legit tab. I will also link that in the chat. And then Diana, do you have anything else to add?
Yeah, hi, thank you for joining. And I just want to say a couple things. We've had a really active and busy couple weeks on the advocacy front. Yesterday, I was in Sacramento advocating on behalf of the Nevada County cannabis industry in support of AB 564, which would freeze cannabis taxes at 15%. So that would significantly impact our small farmers as well as our retailers and all of the entire cannabis supply chain. And so stay tuned for in our newsletters that we put out every 2 weeks. We put updates on the bills and the positions that we're taking on various bills, but it's a very active legislative season so far. We're also monitoring AB 8, which would be the potential integration of hemp into the cannabis supply chain, and several other bills. And we are going to Sacramento and lobbying on behalf of our cannabis industry here. We're also working on local policy changes as we continue to do so. Every year we make changes to our local ordinance, and we are working on creating greater parity between cannabis and our local agriculture industry. So trying to relook at some of the regulations related to cannabis. And so, yeah, hand it back to you, Erin, and thank you so much, Huck, for being here with us today.
Yeah, awesome. Thanks, Diana. And I will pass it to Huck. You can feel free to introduce yourself. And thank you so much for being here. We really appreciate it.
Of course. Thank you for the opportunity. Hi, guys. My name is Huck Ingram. I am a local attorney in Nevada County. I have been involved or I've seen the cannabis industry evolve over the years from a time when it was very, very much illicit market to a time where the legality was a little bit more gray to the time in which there were ordinance passed and pathways for legalization. And I've seen sort of things that the county has done and things that the state has done. So I'm aware as to what challenges this particular industry has faced. I also, do a lot of business entity formation. So there was a time where cannabis businesses were sort of the up and coming businesses that a lot of people were starting up and creating. And sort of in line with that, I think probably most people on today's call know general business structures and know differences and distinctions between sole proprietorships, LLCs, corporations, C corps and S corps. I have some things that I can say about that if you have questions. But I don't want today to bore you or to be another business conversation in a vacuum. So I would much rather this be productive to you and to answer specific questions. With that, I'm happy to take kind of whatever questions you have, and I can also sort of defer some of that for a greater conversation because I think that this is supposed to be a relatively surface conversation about what different structures allow for and sort of the ease and the flexibility or what structures investors typically interface with. I don't necessarily feel like for attorney-client purposes, today is supposed to create that relationship or be a deep dive into what that conversation really is if you engage on a more private level.
Cool. Thanks, Huck. And I just want to remind everyone that there is a chat box. There's a Q&A box in the bottom of your screen as well. But what would be most beneficial is if you could raise your hand and then I can press this button next to your name that allows you to talk. And then you can just speak directly with Huck. That way you can get your question across more clearly. So let us know if you have any questions. Feel free to raise your hand or put questions in a Q&A or chat box.
And while we're waiting, I should also say that I'm happy to have a more boring conversation if need be. So if what you want is just sort of a general resuscitation of different business structures and ways that you can move forward with certain ideas, I'm happy to talk about that. I just didn't want to do it if that wasn't going to be helpful to anybody.
I think a general overview would be really helpful. A nice, boring overview of entity structures. And then we can, dive into some more specific questions. And then there may even just be some other random ask questions for you while we have you on the line. But yeah, I think just a general overview would be really great for us.
Definitely. I can do that. I promise.
Thank you, Huck.
So generally, when you think about entity structuring or business structuring, the first thing that you need to decide is how it is that you're going to do business, whether or not you're going to be personally responsible for your business. So from a liability perspective, whether or not you're going to be personally liable for the things that you are doing in a business capacity. And so you need to decide whether or not you're going to be doing business as a sole proprietorship or whether or not you're going to try and have some sort of liability limiting entity sort of in front of you. And so whether or not you're going to conduct business as an LLC or whether or not you're going to conduct business as either a C Corp or an S Corp. Really, when it comes to business, and there are partnerships and there are all sorts of different things that we can talk about if that sort of tickles your inquiry. But when you think about business entity structuring, what a lot of people are really referring to is LLCs, corporations and how many of them do I need? Do I need to have one for each activity? Do I need to have just one that can hold all of my activities? Um, there are certain flexibilities that operating as an LLC provides, um, that a corporation doesn't provide, which is why typically investors are more interested in giving their money to a corporation as opposed to an LLC. Like a corporation, it has shareholders that are the owners of the company, but it is also managed by a board of directors, and it usually delegates the day-to-day operation to various officers. It's required to have a president, a secretary, and a CFO. Um, so most LLCs that I wind up creating mimic the structure of a corporation because of the benefits that it provides, even though the corporation's code that has certain requirements for corporations merely posits them as recommendations for LLCs. In my opinion, if you're really trying to limit yourself from liability, you're going to run your LLC like a corporation, and as much work as you can do to distance yourself personally from your business structure, the better. So you don't want to commingle funds. You want to have a separate bank account. You typically want to have an operating agreement. Even if you're a sole member LLC or a sole shareholder corporation, it's very, very, very important to do those sorts of have annual meeting minutes, or director resolutions or member resolutions. Do something so that if you have to get somebody who has no idea what it is that you are doing on board with what you're doing and separating yourself as an individual from the activities of the business, I think that that is very, 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 very important, from a liability limiting perspective. So the real business structures that I would say 95% or more of businesses, the real categories that they fall into are, like I said, either LLCs or corporations. And by corporations, I'm looping in C corporations and S corporations. And that is primarily a tax designation, with an additional form that is filed with the IRS. But both C Corps and S Corps in the eyes of the state are filed as C corporations.
I have a question. Are there business structures that are best suited for cannabis businesses, or have you had experience with that in particular?
Well, I think that that's a good question. I think that it depends on sort of the savviness and also the overall, um, goal as to where that business is headed. So I think that most cannabis businesses conduct themselves and form as LLCs. The reason being primarily is because they're easier to operate. The things that are requirements with corporations are recommendations with LLCs. And so usually individuals feel like they have a little bit more flexibility and freedom, and it is less expensive typically to operate an LLC than a corporation. That said, most businesses, if you were to look at Target or if you were to look at, whatever, most of those businesses are corporations. Um, Primarily because, or maybe not primarily because, but often because they need to separate out ownership and management. They're taking or they're availing themselves to investor dollars. And so if you think, now being a cannabis business is just like being any other business with an asterisk. I mean, it's maybe harder because it's like being a business that is heavily regulated. And so, a lot of what structure you're ultimately going to want to choose is is going to be dependent upon where you see yourself going from this point to the end goal.
What if you have, so if you're starting out, it's just you, let's say you and a partner. Uh,
Yep.
does that make a difference if you have contract workers or like a team of people? Does that change the structure of how you set up your business?
Um, that's another good question. It doesn't have to. So like my answer would be no, because if you're doing business, I think that you should be an LLC. If you're choosing to not have that separation between you personally and your business, your company, um, then you're going to be doing business as a sole proprietorship or a partnership. And that is, maybe going to be impacting your decision to bring or engage other labor, or not. I don't know if that answers your question or makes sense, but yeah, I think that anytime there is anybody involved in your business, you're going to want to limit your own personal liability. I would assume.
And what would be, so in the cannabis industry, there's a lot of permits and licensing that goes along with having your business structure in place. Does that make it easier or harder depending if you have an LLC or a corporation like later on down the line to add these kinds of licenses and things to your business? Like
I
one
think,
thing be easier over the other?
um, I don't, so from the perspective of whether or not it is easier to add a license type to an LLC or a corporation, I don't think that one is necessarily, well, I shouldn't say easier. Um, I don't think that one makes a license more available than another. Typically it is easier to run an LLC than to run a corporation. And so, in terms of just approval of that activity, you're probably going to have an easier time approving that activity as an LLC than you might have approving that activity as a corporation. But that is also going to be dependent on the number of people that have some sort of say behind the scenes. A single shareholder corporation and a single member LLC is probably going to have just as easy of a time making a decision than a multi-member LLC or a multi-shareholder and multi-director corporation.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah.
Elise has a question. Elise, I'm gonna allow you to speak. Go ahead.
Unmute. Hi guys. What are the tax differences between an LLC and an S corp?
So an LLC and an S corp are effectively taxed the same way. So that's a really great question, Elise. Um, S corporation allows for pass-through taxation, which is what an LLC has to begin with. And so typically the tax implications between those two structures are largely the same. Um, what might make some sort of difference one way or the other is the cost of preparing tax returns for those two particular structures. And that conversation is really dependent upon whether or not there are multiple members of the LLC, in which case the LLC is basically treated as a partnership, or whether or not there are multiple shareholders. It has to, in order to be an S corporation, you have to have, I think it's less than 100 shareholders and you can only have one class of shares. So preparation of that sort of tax return, if you are not a single shareholder or a single member LLC, um, that can become more complex, if that makes sense. I
Mm,
know that it's a little bit ambiguous
mm,
because it's not necessarily black and white. But that's generally what what I would think of is there shouldn't be a lot of difference between the way that those two entities are taxed.
Thank you for that.
You're welcome. And I should also put an asterisk, take whatever tax questions you have with a grain of salt, because that would typically be a CPA, not necessarily an attorney. I don't practice tax law, so I'm not up to snuff
Mm, mm,
on the latest.
mm,
But
mm,
in general, an S corp and an LLC are taxed the same.
mm.
Look, I have a question for you, and we're going to take us a little bit off topic, but then I want to bring us back. Well, actually, let me just say this. Before I take us off topic, I want to stay on this. Does anybody have questions specifically about some of these entity structures? I know that there's some people who've tuned in who are just setting up their cannabis business or maybe restructuring things. Does I really want to, anyone have any questions? This is a great
Okay.
opportunity. Go for it, Elise.
Okay. Oh, hi. Sorry. Okay, I'm still on here. I'm like eating peanuts and stuff. I apologize. I
All
just got
good.
back from taking my kid to school and I've been bagging meat all day. So, um, so I currently have an S corp. However, I've heard that maybe I should actually create a management company or a holding company, then nestle my S corp under that, and then create maybe like a separate LLC to then do things like merch sales. Because then under the LLC, if it's not associated with my cannabis
Not a can of,
business,
yeah.
then I can actually sell like my merch, which has like no cannabis necessarily to it. And then I'd be able to use like an online payment platform like Square or Stripe for that sort of thing, and or also for consulting services.
Yep.
And then, yeah, but I don't know, like, I don't know if a management company is the same thing as a holding company.
So they're different. That's true, that to the extent that you can, because the cannabis industry is a heavily regulated industry and there's still a lot of federal prohibitions. And even though I say, well, you're just a regular business, um, that's also with an asterisk because you are treated differently. And so for things like write-offs, for things like services that will do business with you, um, if you have a non-cannabis related activity, then that particular entity has an easier time, like you pointed out, getting access to certain services like banking, like credit card processing, like Square, like you avoid from the tax perspective, you avoid some of the 280E issues. Um, and so, yes, to the extent that you can stratify your business and create multiple businesses where you have cannabis activity under one umbrella and more quote unquote legitimate activity under another umbrella, then you can take advantage of some of those things that you run into trouble with, or you have to jump over hurdles if you're only engaged in the cannabis activity. Going back to your question, a holding company you can think of as a bucket that just hold assets. A management company is an entity that contracts, usually with the holding company, to manage the holding company's assets, if that makes sense.
I feel like I need something written down, I need a flow chart.
So the way that I would think about it is if get a piece of paper in front of you and just draw a bucket, and that bucket is your holding company, and draw a circle next to it and label that circle as your management company. And then you can list out different assets that whether or not it's real property, whether or not it's IP, whether or not it's tractors, whatever it is that you can put into that holding company. And then you can have the management company contract with the holding company in order to actually make those assets productive, whether or not it's licensing intellectual property like branding, whether or not it's renting out a tractor, whether or not it's a lease for the real property. It's kind of up to the management company how it wants to make those assets productive in the situation that you and I are discussing with a true holding company and a true management company.
I mean, is one better than the other? Like if I was just going to have one, what would be more beneficial?
There is not just a one, because what's going to happen is you're going to have to hold and manage all from the same entity.
Hmm.
So the way to think about things is or one way to think about things in terms of liability is each entity structure is kind of a fire door between other entities. And so if you only have one entity structure, then in theory, that entity is going to hold everything and manage everything. You can create a situation where you might personally hold everything. So you might serve as the holding company that is then managed by a different quote unquote management company. But there, like I said at the very beginning, I think that there are potential issues if you personally control or hold assets, because those are subject to your own personal liability. So let's say, for instance, you own a house and you own it personally, and then you go out and get in an auto accident and you don't have insurance that could cover the amount of damage that you cause or the amount of harm that you cause to somebody. Well, then you're technically personally liable, and absent, homeowner exemption and blah, 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 your house could technically be used as an asset to satisfy a judgment. So it's nice to have separation between you as a person, ownership of your assets, and management of those assets. But it doesn't always make sense, because you also have to balance that out with the fact that we're talking about two LLCs or two entities. So you not only have the startup costs associated with those, but you have annual maintenance costs, which are, certainly two $800, filing fees with the Secretary of State for having your entity. You're probably going to have a CPA for one or both entities. You're going to have to prepare tax returns. You might have separate bookkeeping. And so it's very quick that the expense associated with entities becomes challenging. You can kind of have the tail wag the dog, so to speak.
Okay. Hmm.
So,
Oh, sorry. Go on.
oh no, go ahead, Diana.
No, please say what you're going to say. I don't want to.
Well, I was just going to say you have to be very careful, because um, you want to grow proportionally. So a lot of times people will have this really great idea as to what they want their structure to look like at the end, but you have years of too much expense and you don't want that to preclude you from actually being able to make it to the end. So you kind of have to, you know, not lose sight of the forest through the trees, what the end's going to look like, but simultaneously recognize that that's a growing process and you can't necessarily just start where you want to end, if that makes sense.
That does make sense. My question as a follow-up is like, what about like here in Nevada County, we have to have a residence on our on the parcel that we are farming.
Yeah.
And so what would you recommend for the ownership of that home to be in as our largest, a trust or an LLC, or like a separate LLC for the home, or separate trust? Like, what are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, that's a good question. So my thought is you definitely need one. So you either, because it's going to serve to protect you from probate. Usually an LLC is something that a trust can own. So in a lot of circumstances, you have clients that will create a trust. They'll own their property in their trust. That does not protect it from liability in the event that there's a judgment. It protects that asset from having to go through probate, and there are certain Medicare clawback provisions that don't apply if that asset is owned by a trust. Um, they'll also typically create a situation where they will have an LLC that is engaged in the cannabis activity, that controls the licenses, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. A lot of times where people get things wrong is they don't necessarily put that LLC into that same trust. And so there are ways that you can get around it with agreements between your trust and your LLC. It's like authorizations. So you can, if you, let's say, want to cultivate and get a license on a property that you don't own, you can, as long as you have permission from the property owner. And so in a similar situation that we're talking about here, where you're talking about stratifying ownership and activity, then you would just need permission from that property owner, which might be or should be different than the actual license holder, if that makes sense.
Got it. Is the LLC, if a home is owned by an LLC, and it doesn't even have to be the cannabis LLC, but if a home is owned by an LLC, is that more bulletproof or
It is
whatever,
more protectable.
protective than a trust?
Yes, it is.
Cool.
It is more limiting of liability.
Cool. Okay.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Would you then have to own the home outright, though? I mean, can you get a mortgage in the name of your LLC or whatever?
So that is going to be dependent on your lender. So I personally have certain LLCs that have mortgages, and the lender lent to the LLC, and yes, I had to sign a personal guarantee. I also have other things that are just held in a trust. And I am the lender, or I'm the borrower, I should say. And the lender is just interfacing with me directly because the lender knows that there's really no distinction between me as an individual and my revocable trust. In order to get going back to Diana's question, though, about sort of limiting liability and protectability, in theory, membership shares, so membership of an LLC or shares of a corporation is considered personal property that is subject to probate if the value is over a certain amount of money. It's 106, I think in California it's still $166,500. So what's really, really important is to avoid probate. You put that entity into your trust, even if it is created as a separate entity for personal liability limiting reasons, if that makes sense. I know it's a little bit confusing, but so that would be my recommendation, is that your money needs to be owned and controlled sort of by or your assets need to be owned and controlled by an LLC that also needs to go within your trust, so that property, that LLC, the ownership of the LLC is not also subject to probate, if that makes sense.
Okay.
Awesome. Great questions, Elise. Thank you. Anyone else have any questions? If not, I have one question from Diana. So
Yep.
Diana had to leave. She has a meeting, but she had a question. What would you recommend for cannabis businesses that are having trouble collecting on money owed from retailers and distributors? Like, could you use things like collection letters, demand
Boy.
letters, things
Yeah,
like
I mean, you can use collection letters. You can, there's not really a good answer to that. What I would say is, you could turn over that debt to a collection agency, maybe, excuse me. And you are probably going to have to take a haircut onto what, that debt ultimately amounts to. But you would have somebody else out there sort of pounding the pavement, and they would be able to threaten, credit or this or that. But collecting debt is very, very challenging, and it is a problem.
We're ready to go.
Okay. That's a toughy one. That's tough then. All right.
Yeah,
You know,
there's not a good answer I mean, my advice would be make sure that whoever you're doing business with is solvent, and if you're going to offer terms, that's as good as a loan. And so, you have to be thinking about, if I'm going to give, this distribution company a certain amount of product to do X with, then you are pretty much loaning them and giving them that product and hoping that you're going to get paid on the back end because they're not paying you up front.
mhm. Yep. Okay. All right.
And you do see that in other industries, but there is a different, more proven track record. So, for instance, if you want Oakley sunglasses in your shop, Oakley's not going to let you just sell their sunglasses and pay them with terms. They're going to say, well, why don't you buy 3 pairs and make sure that you can sell them? And then after we've developed a relationship, we can have a conversation about offering you terms on glasses that you might want to buy on credit. It's no different than that.
Okay. Well, thank you.
I have a related question.
Great.
Yep.
Patrick Marsh owes me over $11,000. I have filed a claim with Cannabis Collects. Can I make a poster of him calling him out as a thief and send it to every single distributor in California on a postcard, letting them know that he doesn't pay farmers?
Well, the law of defamation, truth is an absolute defense. So if what you are saying is absolutely true,
I filed a claim with the DCC.
then you have not defamed that individual. Whether or not, I mean, I would personally advise against it as an attorney,
Why?
because I just feel like it's not going to get you paid. Is my own, so I've done it long enough where I don't think that type of tactic is going to get you paid in the event that they're ignoring you.
Oh, I doubt I'll get paid whatsoever, but at this point, am I allowed to call his family members and request payment from them?
No,
Why?
because you didn't do business with his family members. You don't can you call him? Can you call his entity? But I don't know what his entity structure is. I don't know if his family members are involved in his business. So his family members are typically not responsible for his debt unless he's 15.
Okay.
So yeah, what I would probably do, and I know that it's a tough thing to say, but I would probably write it off as bad debt.
Oh, I'm sure that's what's
And
going to have to happen.
yeah, that's probably what I would do.
Okay. And I guess I had one more question about that as well, which is apparently he has absconded to Texas. Can I file some sort of claim in Texas because he owes me money? Because it's over $11,000, so I think that puts it over small claims court. But
Yeah, but
can
if you can get I'd sue him for the maximum amount in small claims court and take him to small claims court and get a judgment.
Okay.
I mean, that's probably what I would, if I were really concerned, because he's probably not going to pay you. So you can either write it off, in my opinion, and confirm with your CPA what they would advise you to do. But you could either write it off as bad debt, or you could try and turn it into a judgment that he owes you money on that's going to collect, legal interest. And at that point, can you write it off? I don't think so. But do you have something else that is basically a promise, another piece of paper that he promises to pay you under? Yes. Um, but that's far from meaning that he's going to make good on that obligation.
But I guess how does it work in small claims court if he currently lives in, if he like moved to another state?
Yeah, I mean, I don't know what his entity structure looks like. I mean, it's a very, very, very it's a very, very complicated process because usually for like breach of contract, you can bring a claim in the county where the contract was entered into or where the defendant resides, typically. And so I don't know where the contract was entered into. I don't know if there is a contract. I don't know. I don't know
I mean, there's
so
an
much.
invoice. Does the invoice count as a contract?
No, usually like you're talking about he was a distributor, right?
Correct. So in September, I gave him about $22,000 worth of product. He gave me 50% down, net 30, basically owed me about 11 grand and change. Um, and then totally gave me a runaround, claimed that my product didn't test high, sent me pictures of test results that did not list me or my farm as the actual grower. Um, Broadway Alliance is the distributor. I spoke with the owner of Broadway Alliance, and apparently he rents out his distro license to people, but he makes them sign something saying that they'll pay. So the collection agency is saying that, oh, well, now this guy's saying he's not responsible because he's not Patrick Marsh, but he has contracts with Patrick Marsh. Um, and so I'm just wondering what else I can do to apply pressure to, yeah, whatever. At least at this point,
It's
just fuck this guy and make his life a
Yeah,
little bit harder.
it sounds like at this point you write it off as bad debt and a learning, chalk it up to a learning lesson where you don't do business with somebody like that in the future. And if you do, you get a more ironclad agreement and upfront costs or upfront payment. So if they do walk away and don't pay you anything, it's it's not that big of a deal.
Okay. Well, and he ended up stealing from other people. He skipped out on his rent in LA. So
Yeah. Yeah,
I've been able
there's
to
been a
dig.
lot of that. I mean, this isn't the first situation that I'm hearing of, or the first distributor, or there are a lot of people that are sort of scratching their heads, thinking, "Gosh, I really got taken advantage of, and this person just skipped town." And that person or those people owe a lot of people money, and it's kind of like, unfortunately, you fall within in that grouping.
Okay. Hmm.
Okay, those are great questions, Elise. Thank you. We are wrapping up soon, everyone. So any questions that you have, this is your opportunity. Um, love to hear from you. All right, Pat Rockwell, go for it.
Hey, Pat.
Oh, hi, Huck. Um, I don't know how many people have arranged their company like this. We're Green Gift is an LLC, and we have an arrangement to pay a certain amount of a lease per month to me to the trust that holds our
Yep, to the owner.
yeah to the owner. Um, but we can't afford to pay it now, that
Yep.
lease amount. How do we handle that? Is that
Well,
a accounting question or is that a legal question?
it's a little bit both. I mean, if you want to evict Green Gift, you can as the owner. But most of the time, you're not going to want to do that if you're kind of behind both entities. And so you, as the owner, might say, well, I'm going to forgive this lease payment, or, I'm going to reduce this lease payment. But at the end of the day, it's really up to you what you want to do. The trust isn't going to be able to show that income. The business isn't able to pay the lease amount.
Mm.
And so it's really up to the owner as to whether or not they're going to say, you can't continue to operate and conduct your business on my property, or whether or not the owner's going to say, yeah, you know what, do whatever you want to do. And I'm okay with $0 while you try and turn this around. And if you're successful, great. If you're not successful, then the result is the same as if you evicted them now.
Can you?
Okay. So legally though, there's nothing because I don't know if it's in the operating docs or whatever of the LLC. We do have that in there, right? That Green Gift owes that.
Yep.
So just in terms of, there's no legal thing since I'm not going to kick Green Gift out.
Yeah, I
Um,
mean the only thing that if you were going to kick Green Gift out, then you would have to give Green Gift notice of their default. You would have to give them the ability to cure, and then you would technically have to go through eviction procedure, unlawful detainer procedure, unless they just said, yeah, you know what, Pat, we're throwing our hands up and we want to be done. Please let us off the hook.
so I
Uh,
do the conversation in the mirror, right?
right. Yeah.
Cool. I
In your
mean,
situation, it's not going to matter. You're
yeah,
not going to do that.
exactly. Cool. Thank you.
Yeah.
I have a follow-up question to that, which is because we're in a similar situation where our farm is supposed to be paying us, ha ha. Can you set it up so that basically like the person, me, is essentially like loaning that money then to the S Corp, and like can I collect back rent? Like, I don't know, maybe I have a gangbusters year and I can just sort of collect on back rent. Like,
Yeah, you can also, I mean, what I would say at that point is it's really an accounting thing, and it's this company hasn't paid rent for, such and such time. They're now in a position where what they owe is X number of dollars, and they've come on money somehow, and so they want to go back and clear the air and make good on the prior obligations. And when and how that's accrued and booked and et cetera, and shows up as income, and that would be an accounting question, not an attorney question. But you could, I don't think that you need an agreement because it's just you both directions. Um, but if you were a landlord and if somebody else was the cannabis entity, then I would want an agreement with them that when they come across money, the first thing that they're going to do, or one of the first things that they're going to do, is they're going to pay the obligation, the rental obligation that they owe you. Um, but in your situation, just like in Pat's situation, that really doesn't matter if you're, in my opinion, if you're both people, because you're not going to kick yourself out and you're not going to sue yourself.
okay.
Okay, everyone, we have time for about one more question. If anyone has any burning questions left after hearing all the questions that have been asked, feel free to ask them. Like I said, time for one more. And if there are no other questions, Huck, I want to give you an opportunity, just if you have any last remarks or anything for the group for some takeaways. And then
I
we can
guess my last remark is just good luck in business. Business is challenging. It's pulling at a lot of different strings. And so regardless of what entity structure you choose, um, it's not a quick, easy journey. There's a lot of longevity in it, but that takes actually setting yourself up for some of that longevity. And I don't necessarily think that it is, you can't really rely on anybody other than I think the Alliance to fight for you in terms of a cannabis business. I don't think that the state necessarily has done a great job creating infrastructure. So, just I know you've heard before, but it's a marathon, not a race. I think that that is really, really true with any business, but with the cannabis business in particular. Um, and so, my advice is if you go through the rigmarole and the expense of creating an entity, manage your entity appropriately so that your money is well spent as opposed to lost the second that you spend it. Because that's what an entity that is not run correctly and is not managed correctly does, is it's basically pierceable and it's no entity at all. And then you wind up in a situation where you wasted X number of dollars and X amount of time on something that didn't actually protect you and that you didn't need.
Yep, that is a great takeaway. And I hope everyone got what they needed and came for in this webinar. And we thank you all so much for joining us. This was great. And Huck, thank you so much for being with us. You are
Yeah,
awesome. It was
of
excellent.
course. Thank you. And don't hesitate to reach out if you have any questions. My office number is 432, or I'm sorry, 530-432-1996. And my email address is huck@ingrambrady.com. So if you need to dive deeper, I'm happy to have a conversation. But hopefully your questions got answered.
Yep, I think they did. Awesome. Thank
Cool.
you so much, Huck. Thanks so much, everyone. Have a
Thank
wonderful
you.
rest of your day. And thanks for joining us. Take care.
Thank you. You too.
Bye.
Bye-bye.